All right, everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty mind-blowing. The idea that consciousness could actually be the same thing as attention.
Definitely a fascinating concept.
Yeah, our jumping off point is a conversation between James Berryhill and, get this, an AI chatbot.
Oh, wow. Using AI to explore consciousness. Very meta.
Right, and it gets really deep really fast. They dig into how our brains might create consciousness and even touch on the whole free will debate.
Sounds intriguing. So where does this idea that consciousness attention even come from?
Well, Berryhill starts off with kind of a radical idea. He says consciousness isn't something we start with, it's something we arrive at. That's like instead of having a self that then becomes aware, he's saying our sense of self is actually built from all the information our brains are constantly taking in.
So it's not a separate I that becomes conscious. The I itself is kind of a product of how our brains interpret everything.
Exactly. It's like the I is emerging from all those perceptions, not the other way around.
Okay, I'm following so far. But how does attention fit into all of this?
Well, that's where Berryhill brings in these two key brain networks. You've got the task positive network, the TPN.
Okay, I've heard of that one. That's the network that kicks in when we're focused on, well, tasks, right? Or just anything external.
You got it. Like if you're working on a project or maybe just really engrossed in a conversation, that's your TPN doing its thing.
Right, right. And I'm guessing the other network is the one that's active when we're kind of zoned out thinking about our own stuff.
Exactly. That's the default mode network, or DMN for short. Daydreaming, reminiscing, just letting your mind wander, that's the DMN in action.
Interesting. So we've got these two networks, one for outward focus and one for inward focus. What's the connection to consciousness?
Well, here's the thing. These two networks, they're like on a seesaw.
A seesaw?
Yeah, when one is active, the other one gets suppressed. And get this, at least one of them is always active when we're awake.
So even when we're just vegging out on the couch, some part of our brain is still paying attention to something, whether it's the TV or our own thoughts.
That's what Berryhill argues. And he takes it even further. He says that this back and forth, this constant interplay between the TPN and the DMN, that's fundamentally tied to consciousness itself.
Whoa. So he's saying that because one of these attention networks is always on, we're always conscious, even if we're not really aware of it.
That's the idea. It's like attention and consciousness are so closely linked, they might actually be two sides of the same coin.
Makes you wonder what happens when we're asleep then. Because I don't think I'm paying much attention to anything when I'm in dreamland.
That is a great question, and it's one that Berryhill tackles head-on. He uses sleep as a sort of starting point for his whole argument, and we'll get into that right after the break. Okay, so before the break, we were talking about sleep and how that fits into this whole idea of consciousness being attention.
Right, because if we're not really paying attention to anything when we're asleep, does that mean we're not conscious either?
And if consciousness is attention, how does that work?
Well, Berryhill says when we're in deep sleep, both the TPN and the DMN, those attention networks, they're pretty much offline.
So like our brains are on standby, not really focused on anything.
Exactly. And because of that, we're not conscious either. He actually uses this as evidence for his argument. It's like, hey, no attention, no consciousness. They seem to go hand in hand.
Okay, I see where he's going with that. But what about those times when we're awake, but we're not really focused on the outside world, like when we're daydreaming?
Ah, good point. But even then, Berryhill says one of those networks is still active.
So like if I'm lost in thought about my next vacation, my DMN is fired up, but my TPN is taking a break.
Exactly. You're still paying attention just to your internal world instead of the external one. So according to his theory, you're still conscious. It's just a different kind of consciousness.
So it's not so much that we're always conscious of everything. It's more like the act of paying attention itself is what makes us conscious, whether it's directed inwards or outwards.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. The focus of our attention might shift, but the act of attending, that seems to be the key.
This is really making me rethink things. But what about those times when we're kind of on autopilot? You know, like when you're driving a familiar route and you suddenly realize you don't even remember the last few miles.
Ah, yes. Those moments when we're just going through the motions.
Are we really conscious then?
Berryhill actually argues that even in those seemingly automatic actions, the TPN is still involved. Things like motor memory, keeping an eye on the road, responding to unexpected situations, that all requires attention, even if we're not fully aware of it.
So even when part of our mind is wandering, another part is still paying attention, making sure we don't crash the car or walk into a wall.
Right. He says even though there might be some overlap between the networks, one is always dominant.
So, like, even if I'm daydreaming while walking down the street, some part of my attention is still focused on not tripping over cracks in the sidewalk.
Precisely.
Okay, so this raises a pretty big question about free will.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Because if consciousness is basically attention, and attention is controlled by these brain networks, does that mean we don't really have control over our own choices?
Now you're getting into the really deep philosophical stuff. If these networks are calling the shots, and we're not consciously aware of everything they're doing, does that mean our actions are predetermined?
Yeah, that's a pretty unsettling thought.
It is. And it's something Berryhill grapples with, too. He suggests that if free will requires consciousness and consciousness requires attention, then when we're asleep and attention is totally gone, so is free will.
So following that logic, even when we are awake, if our choices are being made by these networks outside of our conscious awareness, then maybe we don't have as much control as we think we do.
It's a tough question to wrap your head around, no doubt about it. It's like, if we're only conscious of the end result of a decision, but all the underlying processes are happening in the background, is that really free will?
This is definitely making me question some things. So how does Berryhill's perspective on consciousness as attention address that classic hard problem? You know, the whole mystery of how physical matter, like our brains, can create subjective experiences.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we get from neurons firing to the feeling of joy or the taste of chocolate?
It seems impossible to explain.
It's definitely one of the biggest challenges in understanding consciousness. But Berryhill's approach offers an interesting angle. He starts by pointing out that even perception itself, how we experience the world through our senses, that's already subjective.
Subjective? How so?
Well, think about it. No two people have exactly the same sensory mechanisms. Even something as basic as the color red, everyone might call it red, but the actual way each person's brain processes that wavelength of light, it's going to be slightly different.
So even though we all agree that a fire truck is red, the experience of redness might be a little different for each of us.
Right. And if those basic building blocks of perception, the way we see, hear, taste, smell, touch, if all of that is already subjective, and if consciousness is built on top of those perceptions, well...
And consciousness itself has to be subjective, too.
Exactly. It's like, if the ingredients are subjective, the final dish can't be perfectly objective.
That's a great way to put it. I'm starting to see how this all ties together. So our individual perceptions are subjective. Consciousness is built on those perceptions, and consciousness is connected to both our internal and external worlds through those attention networks.
Right. It's like a bridge between the objective physical world and our subjective inner experience.
It's like our brains are constantly weaving these two things together, creating this tapestry of conscious experience that's unique to each of us.
That's a beautiful analogy, and it leads us to another fascinating part of Berryhill's argument, the evolutionary angle.
Oh, so he's bringing evolution into this, too.
He does. He suggests that attention itself, the ability to focus on something, that's an evolutionary adaptation. It helps all animals, not just humans, survive and reproduce. Think about it. If you can't pay attention to danger, you're more likely to get eaten. If you can't pay attention to potential mates, you're not going to pass on your genes.
Right. Attention is definitely crucial for survival.
So if consciousness, ascension, as Berryhill argues, then it makes sense to think that consciousness also serves that same basic evolutionary purpose.
So our ability to be aware of ourselves and the world, to experience all those thoughts and feelings, it could all be traced back to this fundamental drive to survive and keep the species going.
That's the idea. He even connects it to the concept of homeostasis. Our bodies drive to maintain balance. You know, we get thirsty when we need water, hungry when we need food.
Right. Those sensations make us act in ways that ensure our survival.
Exactly. And those sensations, they're part of our conscious experience. They drive our behavior, influence our decisions, and ultimately shape who we are. Berryhill is suggesting that consciousness, if it is attention, plays a central role in how we interact with the world and fulfill our biological needs.
So it's like our entire conscious experience, our awareness of everything, is ultimately a reflection of this deep-seated biological drive to survive and thrive.
It really makes you think about the bigger picture, doesn't it? What does it mean for our understanding of the human mind if consciousness is ultimately rooted in these very basic biological processes?
It definitely opens up a lot of new questions.
It does, and it has implications for fields beyond just neuroscience, like psychology, philosophy, even artificial intelligence.
Wow, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation. This whole idea that consciousness might actually be attention, it really challenges the way we think about ourselves and our place in the world.
Absolutely. But as with any deep dive into a complex topic, we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore here, and I'm sure our listener has a lot to ponder after all of this.
Definitely a lot to chew on. So where do we go from here? What are some things our listeners might want to think about after this deep dive?
I think one of the biggest takeaways here is how this new perspective, this idea that consciousness eyes attention, changes how we think about our own experiences.
Right. Does it change how we see the world, how we interact with it?
Exactly. It really highlights just how crucial attention is in our lives.
And if attention really is the foundation of consciousness, like Berryhill argues, then maybe it's even more important to understand how it works, how we can strengthen it.
Absolutely. You know, thinking about consciousness this way, it might even help us be more aware of those times when our attention isn't working so well, like when we're distracted or we just can't seem to focus.
Well, that's interesting. So give us some insight into why it's so hard to stay focused sometimes. And maybe even give us some new tools for getting our attention back on track.
Exactly. It's like, okay, if my attention eyes my consciousness, then I better figure out how to manage this thing.
I like that. What about those other states of consciousness, the ones where our attention shifts dramatically, like during meditation?
Yeah, or even under the influence of certain substances. That's another fascinating area to explore. If Berryhill's theory is right, then figuring out how attention changes in those altered states could give us a whole new understanding of consciousness itself.
It really does feel like this deep dive has opened up a whole new way of looking at ourselves and the world around us.
It has for me, for sure.
It's a good reminder that we still have so much to learn, so much to question when it comes to the human mind.
And to be open to new ideas, even the ones that really challenge our existing beliefs.
Well said. So, to all our listeners out there, keep diving deep, keep questioning, and keep exploring this amazing world of consciousness and attention. Until next time, happy exploring.